Hello BookTube, this is Weekly Reads, and I've had a very rough reading week this week. So let's get going because this might take a while and it could get rather ranty. So, the first book I intended to read this past reading week was The Last Sun by Katie Edwards. I wanted to reread The Last Sun in order to prepare for the release of the third book in the Tarot Sequence. The Tarot Sequence is an urban fantasy series set in the city of New Atlantis, which occupies half of the island of Nantucket. In this setting, Atlantean refugees settled New Atlantis, Nantucket, after the Atlantean World War. The Atlanteans have magical powers, and excuse me, their nobility in this setting inspired, but obviously are inspired by the major arcana of the tarot. The series itself is about Lord's son, Rune St. John, who 20 years before the series begins, his court was attacked and decimated, leaving him and his bodyguard companion, Brand, the only two active survivors of the Sun Throne. In the 20 years since, Rune has been working as a mercenary for his benefactor, Lord Tower. The Last Sun is the first book in the series. I also have the second book in the series, The Hanged Man, which I'll get to shortly. So, in The Last Sun, the opening chapter is a standalone case. Rune and Brand are participating in a raid on the Heartthrone, the Lover's Court, for the Tower. The Heartthrone have gotten into any number of horrendous, evil activities, and a number of arcana of the other nobles have decided to gang up and take them down. During this raid, Rune encounters Elena, the Lady Lovers, the head of the Heartthrone. In exchange for a sigil, magical artifact that can store spells, Rune agrees to take care of a package for her, and that package turns out to be her 17-year-old grandson, Max. The main story of The Last Sun is Rune looking for Adam St. Nicholas, the missing godson of the Tower. He's the second son of the Justice Throne, and Rune's search for Adam exposes a conspiracy targeting a number of other major arcana, as well as involving an undead sorcerer and clues to Rune's own past. When I first read the novel when it came out in 2017, I'm thinking it's 2017, I rather liked it. I liked the imaginative world building that Katie Edwards deploys. New Atlantis is a wonderful mishmash of a city. And a lot of the other world building I thought was quite interesting as well. I like the frenetic pace of the story. It's like one action sequence after another, which really sort of propels the reader forward. And I rather liked the campy humor. And I thought the characters were rather affecting. Particularly Max. But I did have a number of major issues with the book as well. In the second chapter, Rune and Brand abuse their new ward, Max. And there are two subsequent scenes in which he's either threatened or assaulted by either Brand or Rune later in the book. And these scenes are so, particularly this first one, is such a dissonance to the developments and to the rest of the book. And it's one of a number of scenes that appear that really aren't addressed or aren't foreshadowed or followed up on. Another one is Rune and Adam are laying low in the estate of another Arcana when Rune makes a comment he could really go for a cigarette or something similar, and Adam says, "I'll join you," or I'll join you, or something. And Rune tries to look for cigarettes or something, and there's a snarky note from Brand saying he took them all because smoking is bad. And then Adam makes a comment that his younger brother Quinn, who's a seer and who's been sort of helping Rune along, does something similar. And I mean, obviously, of course, that bit where Brand and Quinn are sort of being anti-smoking partisans, for lack of a better word, it's the humor in that. I mean, that scene's supposed to be humorous. But the problem is that there's no foreshadowing that Rune is a smoker, nor is this ever followed up on. So it's like it's just this scene that's added for a quick gag, but I mean, could easily have been cut, because besides that quick gag, it has no purpose being there. And there are a number of other scenes in this book and later that kind of have the same problem. It's like there's no follow through, there's no furtherance to it. Another issue is the treatment of female characters, which is a critique of The Last Sun that is most prominent. There are about 6 female characters, and all of them are one-dimensional and have incredibly limited page time. So, yeah. And I thought on my first reading that Katie Edwards played things a little too conservatively, although given Rune's characterization, since I can understand that one, and that part of my critique has kind of died down some. So that was so on the whole, I really enjoyed The Last Sun on my first reading. And then in 2019, I reread the novel again in preparation for the release of the sequel, The Hanged Man, which came out in 2019. So, as I sometimes want to do, I will reread books in a series when new books come out, like the next volume in the series comes out. So, I reread The Last Sun, and my enjoyment factor greatly diminished. I am much more critical of this novel now. The treatment of Max really bugged me. The characterization of Rune and Brand, I don't understand it. Their 35 years old. And they act like frat bros. And the pacing, I think, really kind of, tries to cover up a lot of the flaws in the story. The characters, wasn't as impressed by. The world building has its, flaws. The most obvious, of course, being the tarot inspiration, and the humor really didn't do it for me anymore. So I was considerably disappointed by my reread of The Last Sun. So then I read The Hanged Man, and I hated this book. Oh, I hated it. It's basically about Rune trying to save Max from his fiancée, the Hanged Man. And I didn't like anything about this book. The one positive side, I think, is that Katie Edwards does do a lot more with female characters. He introduces a number of new characters, and they're rather prominent. So that's one improvement, but he doesn't really improve in any other way, sadly. And again, there's a scene where Rune and Max Rune kind of adopts him, and it's like, did you forget that whole thing where you're abusive to him? And you're also kind of parasitic towards your boyfriend. So I really hated this book. Which makes you wonder, what the heck was I thinking pre-ordering the Hourglass Throne Book 3 and deciding to do another reread of The Last Sun and then The Hanged Man, which would have been my first reread. It's been almost 3 years in my defense, because The Hanged Man came out in 2019, and so it's been about 2.5 years since that. And I do have a tendency to, once I pick up a few volumes in the series, that I will continue with it, even if I'm not necessarily all that fond of it. So, with the Hourglass Throne being pre-ordered, I decided to go do a reread, and what enjoyment I had from my second rereading completely cratered in the third one. It's bad. I should have left well enough alone and just read it the one time. Anyway, it was just bad. So I bailed. And in case anyone wants to know, I'm preemptively bailing on this one too, although I'm not going to count it. So that was the end of the Terror Sequence by Katie Edwards. I might reference it again for tags or something, but I think largely reading the series, I'm done, and I'll probably try to find the series a new home at some point. Anyway, so after bailing on The Last Sun, I started on the second book I was planning on reading this reading week. And that was Shadowplay by Charles Baxter. This is the story of Wyatt Palmer. He's an assistant city manager for his small hometown. His wife is a magician and a gymnastics teacher. His mother's insane. His aunt is insane too. And his cousin is a sociopathic parasite. And his sister, besides maybe appearing in the first chapter and a few references later, I don't think she really plays much of a role. Anyway, so the main story is that the town's dying, it's depressed, until an old high school classmate of Wyatt's comes with a proposal to build a chemical plant in town. Unfortunately, that chemical plant it pollutes. And I guess at some point Wyatt's going to try to do something about it. I rather liked the first 100 pages of this book. I didn't love it, but it was okay. I thought the writing was strong, the characters were interesting, and I liked sort of the shifts in perspective. And then about a little after 100 pages in, we meet the high school classmate, and he's a piece of work. He's cartoonishly evil and reprehensible, and it's like, yeah, all of the subtlety of a sledgehammer, and that just really put me off. And then the very next chapter is a complete switch in perspective to a second person in which the reader becomes Wyatt, or kind of, I guess, is seeing it from Wyatt's perspective, where Wyatt's aunt is telling him a story of how he almost drowned. And while this sort of commentary, this sort of story of Wyatt almost drowning before we first see him in the first chapter, it just, I mean, there probably will be some kind of payoff for this later on, but I didn't stick around to see it, so I bailed, which is annoying because this is yet another of the books I had selected for my America 20 project, which I came up with in 2020 as a way to really engage more with literary fiction. And pretty much of the ones that I've collected, I failed on all but one. And that one was okay. I rather liked it, but it wasn't spectacular. So anyway, so I bailed on Shadowplay. So after that disappointing Saturday, I decided to try to switch gears and read some history. So I was going to read Cleopatra the Great by Joanne Fletcher. Yes, Joanne Fletcher. For some odd reason, I'm having a moment where Joanne Fletcher and the cookbook author Joanne Weir are interchangeable. So if I refer to Joanne Weir or say Weir, I mean Joanne Fletcher. So I was going to read Cleopatra the Great, and then move on to The Making of a King by Robin Waterfield. This is his history of the reign of Antigonus Gonatas. So I started on Cleopatra the Great, which is obviously a biography of Cleopatra, drawing on new sources and new interpretations of sources. And I rather liked what I was reading. I mean, the writing was good, not necessarily spectacular. It was a very workmanlike, maybe a little too padded with too much information about Alexander the Great and the earlier Ptolemies, and maybe a little too much information about Pompey and Caesar. But I was enjoying it, despite my issues with Fletcher's arguments towards Cleopatra deserving the title of the Great, which involved her sort of dragging Hatshepsut a bit. But everything sort of, my enjoyment of the book kind of fell apart with a lacuna. So basically, once Cleopatra became became queen, or sort of, I guess, the senior monarch, because in Ptolemaic Egypt, the kingship was shared between the king and the queen. So sort of a dual monarchy, with both monarchs being co-equal. Normally in these situations, the senior king would have his heir be the junior king, so that the succession would be smooth, and the younger king would be better prepared to rule on their own during that period before their own heir was ready to become a junior king. But in the Ptolemaic period, since Ptolemy II, the sort of the co-monarch was usually the sister wife as the queen. And so the Ptolemies got incredibly messy with the dynastic stuff, as did the Seleucids. Anyway, so getting back to Cleopatra, she became, essentially, after her father Ptolemy Auletes died, she became sort of, in a way, the senior monarch, because her younger brother was, I think, in his early teens. So she, we're told, tried to become the only monarch. So she sort of, cultivated the native Egyptians and worked with that elite, with the native elite and native Egyptians, to try to elevate her own status above that of her younger brother. But then somehow or other, her younger brother couped her and managed to demote her, and then completely remove her from her position. And that, like, how did this happen? What? Because we're told that Cleopatra was the most talented of her siblings. So how could she get outplayed by her younger brother, even with his advisors? Because you would think the first thing she would do would be to remove them before they could do anything to her. And it's just, that really bugged me. And then the introduction of Pompey and Caesar, just, I had to bail. Which was a bit frustrating, because, I did like, and I do like, Fletcher's The Story of Egypt. But I don't know if it's just I haven't found the right Cleopatra biography, or if it's just I don't particularly like Cleopatra. I don't know. Because I have read the Stacy Schiff biography, and I'm not particularly fond of that one. I'm not fond of that one either. So, anyway. So, after bailing on Cleopatra the Great, I despaired of whether or not I should continue on with The Making of a King by Robin Butterfield. So, instead, on Monday, I decided to read Here's a Game We Could Play by Ginny Bittner. This is a 2021 novel set in the mid-90s. It's about a young woman named Claudia who wants to escape her hometown. It's sort of a depressing place, and one of her methods of escape is to create a series of erotic games between her and a fantasy lover. These parts constitute a part of the narrative. The other part of the narrative is basically Claudia trying to find a real-life lover to sort of fill in the role of the fantasy lover. And while the fantasy game parts are rather nicely done, I thought the more realistic narrative was just not terribly well done. I mean, it's in the first person, and it's basically everything wrong with first person narrator goes wrong in this book. And it's dull and rather plodding, and I had to bail. So on Tuesday, I decided to return to The Making of a King by Robin Waterfield, and at least I finished a book this week, because I did finish this, but I didn't like it. It was okay. I liked it enough for an okay, but I didn't love it. It's the history of the reign of Antigonus Gonatas, and it's divided into two parts. The part before Antigonus Gonatas becomes king, and the part afterwards. So the first part is basically divided into a bit of a biography of Antigonus Gonatas, and then looking at his rivals. From Athens, Sparta, the Aetolian and Achaean confederacies, Ptolemaic Egypt, and then the second part looks at his reign, him as the king, his luck in war, or lack thereof sometimes, his relationship with the Greeks, his court, his legacy. So it was a little too fractured, I think, and sometimes repetitive. Also, there was this weird bit in the Sparta chapter where he talks about why the Spartans were weak in this period, and it was basically because the Spartan women, unlike most other Greek women, had a more prominent position in society. They could inherit, and they could sort of had more agency than most Greek women, or the vast majority of Greek women. And so there's this part where, well, one way to sort of restore Spartanness or something was to sort of curtail this, and it's just how it was phrased was just really weird and off-putting. And yeah, so it was okay, but I didn't necessarily like it. So I finished The Making of a King on Thursday, which left today free, annoyingly, because I was hoping I would be able to do a project on Saturday, since on Sunday, which would be May 1st, I was going to start a new project. But I decided to go ahead and do what I was going to do on Saturday, in part today too. So basically, my reading for today and my reading for tomorrow will be devoted to a Try a Chapter tag. Try a Chapter tag is a tag in which you read the first chapter of a book or the first X number of pages and decide on the strength of what you've read whether or not you would continue on with the book. Obviously, the book with the best first chapter is the one that you would read. There is a variation of that tag, though, and that is the one that I saw on Book Olive's channel late last year and early this year. She took a look at her unread fiction shelves and took them down, decided which ones she knew she wanted to read, which ones she knew she wanted to go ahead and discard, and the ones that she wasn't sure about. She opened the comments to her commenters to sort of weigh in and give her their input, and then she would do a try chapter tag and decide whether or not she wanted to keep those books based on the first chapter that she read, or to go ahead and discard them. And so my version of the Try a Chapter tag is going to be in that spirit. The books that I'm looking at are in danger of being purged at some point. I need to exactly work on the mechanics of getting books out of my collection. But anyway, so the 4 books I looked at today were Sorcerer's Son by Phyllis Eisenstein. This is the story of a young sorcerer who goes in search of his father. The Adamantine Palace by Stephen Diaz. This is about dragon knights of some form or other. The Mirror Prince by Violette Milan. This is a portal fantasy in which a human, or seemingly human, young man must return to a fantasy world to stop an evil overlord. And Snakewood by Adrian Selby, which is about a destroyed mercenary company. I'm not going to talk about my impressions on the first chapters. I will do that in a video either Monday or Tuesday. Probably Monday. I think I should have the time to do it on Monday. So tomorrow I'm going to look at Silent Hall by Inez Dolkart. Yeah, which is about, I think, humans trying to fight insane evil gods. The Air of Night by Helen Lowe, which is, I'm not entirely sure what it's about. Half Resurrection Blues by Daniel Jose Older, which is a urban fantasy about a psychopomp. In the Company of Ogres by Ailey Martinez, which is a humorous fantasy, I think. An Accident of Stars by Foz Meadows, which is a feminist portal fantasy. And Breath of Earth by Beth Cato, which I'm not entirely sure what it's about. So I will read them tomorrow, or the first chapter of them tomorrow, and I'll report back on Monday my impressions of the first chapter, and if any of these books will be remaining in my library for me to eventually read, or if I'm going to get rid of the lot of them. Anyway, and then if I have time after that, I will probably look at some cookbooks. So starting on Sunday, May 1st, and going to whenever I finish, I will be reading the entirety of Tsubasa Reservoir Chronicle by Clamp. Tsubasa Reservoir Chronicle is Clamp's big crossover series. It's about a young archaeologist named Sioran who is in love with the princess of the Cloud Country, Princess Sakura. They are, of course, variants of Sakura Kinomoto and Sioran Lee from our card captor Sakura, Clamp's most famous work, I would think. During an archaeological dig, they find an ancient artifact which activates and grievously wounds Sakura. To save Sakura's life, Sioran and Sakura are sent to Earth to consult with the Space-Time Witch, who is a major character in the concurrent Clamp series Exholic. The Space-Time Witch summons, or also has 2 other clients seeking her aid Kuragane, Samurai, and 5D Flowerite, a sorcerer. The Space Time Witch pretty much puts the quartet together alongside a being named Makona to travel to various realities to find pieces of Sakura's soul and memory, which are in the form of feathers. So they go on a quest to find her feathers, and eventually they run up against an antagonist who is manipulating events for his own ends. I first read Tsubasa Reservoir Chronicle about almost 10 years ago, I think, and I quite liked it. I never finished the series. I got about, I think, halfway through, or not quite halfway through. So I'm very much looking forward to reading the entire series in one go, and I want to see how reading an entire series in one go works. Whether or not I'll be tired of it, or what's going to happen. So, starting May 1st is going to be until I finish all Tsubasa Reservoir Chronicle all the time. So, really looking forward to that. Anyway, BookTube, that's what I've been reading and what I will be reading. And since according to my tablet, I've been going on for almost 40 minutes now, I'm going to go ahead and sign off for today. So thank you, BookTube. Have a great weekend, and I will see you on Monday with my Try a Chapter tag. So until then, thank you and stay safe.